The scream came first, before the doors even opened. Lena Hartley froze in the marble corridor, her satchel of herbs pressed against her chest, as two guards dragged a bleeding man past her toward the throne room. Blood dripped in a thin trail across the white floor. She had been in the palace for exactly 6 minutes, and already she understood that this place ran on fear. "Move," one of the guards snapped at her, and she pressed herself against the cold wall to let them pass. She had come from Thornfield, a small border village 3 days' ride from the capital, where she treated fevers and broken bones with dried herbs and steady hands. She had never wanted to come to the royal city. She had never wanted to be noticed by anyone above the rank of village elder. But 2 weeks ago, a wounded noblewoman had been carried into Thornfield half dead from a hunting accident, and Lena's hands had saved her life when the royal physicians, still a full day's ride away, would have arrived too late. That noblewoman turned out to be Lady Priya Ashcombe, cousin to the Alpha King himself. And gratitude, Lena was learning very quickly, could be its own kind of danger. "The king wants to thank you personally," the messenger had told her, as if this were wonderful news. Lena had wanted to laugh, or run. She had heard the stories about King Damien Ashwood, the way every child in every packed territory had heard them, whispered around fires and repeated in markets. The king who took the throne at 23 after his father's mysterious death. The king who had not smiled in public in 6 years. The king whose growl alone was said to have stopped a rebellion in its tracks. No bloodshed required, no words spoken. She had imagined a monster, a giant of a man, with cold eyes, and no mercy in him. Now, standing in this corridor with fresh blood still drying on the floor in front of her, she wondered if the stories had actually been generous. A woman in palace robes appeared beside her, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had walked these halls 10,000 times. "You're the healer from Thornfield," the woman said. "It was not a question. I'm Rosalind Fenwick, head of household staff. You're late. I was told to arrive by sundown. It is not yet sundown. It is by palace time." Rosalind's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Come. He does not like waiting, and tonight is already a difficult night." Lena followed her down the corridor, her heart beating harder with every step. She wanted to ask about the bleeding man, about the blood on the floor, about whatever difficult thing had happened tonight of all nights, but something in Rosalind's tightly set shoulders told her not to ask. Some questions, in this palace, were clearly not meant to be spoken aloud. They passed through an archway carved with wolves in mid-leap, snarling stone faces frozen forever in the act of attack. And Lena felt her stomach drop. This was real. She was really here, in the seat of the Alpha King's power, about to stand in front of a man who could end her life with a single command, and no one would ever ask why. "Chin up," Rosalind murmured, so quietly Lena almost missed it. "Don't look at the floor. Weakness invites cruelty here. Confidence, even fake confidence, is the only shield you have." It was, Lena would later realize, the kindest thing anyone said to her all night. The throne room doors were taller than any doors Lena had ever seen, dark wood banded with iron, each one carved with the same snarling wolf motif as the archway. 2 guards pulled them open without a word, and the sound that rolled out to meet her was not silence, as she had expected, but tension, the kind of thick, humming tension that fills a room right before something breaks. Inside, perhaps 30 nobles stood in loose clusters along the walls, dressed in silks and furs despite the summer heat. All of them turned toward the raised dais at the far end of the hall. On the dais sat a throne carved from black stone, and in the throne sat a man Lena did not need to be told was the king. Even from this distance, even exhausted and terrified as she was, Lena felt something shift in the air around him. He was not shouting, he was not standing. He sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the arm of his throne, watching a kneeling man in front of him, with an expression so controlled it was almost worse than open anger would have been. The kneeling man, the same one who had been bleeding in the corridor, she realized, now flanked by 2 more guards, was talking fast, his words tumbling over each other, some plea or excuse Lena couldn't fully hear from the doorway. "Bring her forward," someone called, and Lena realized with a jolt that the word meant her. Rosalind gave her a small push between the shoulder blades, and Lena's feet carried her forward on their own, down the long aisle between rows of watching nobles, every eye in the room swinging toward her like a single creature turning its head. She kept her chin up the way Rosalind had told her to, even though her knees felt like water, even though every instinct in her body was screaming to turn around and run back out through those enormous doors. The kneeling man was dismissed with a single gesture from the king. Not a word, just 2 fingers lifting slightly from the arm of the throne, and the guards hauled him away through a side door. Lena watched him go, her stomach twisting, and understood that whatever punishment waited for him beyond that door, it had already been decided, and it had been decided without a single raised voice. Then the king's attention turned to her, and every other thought in Lena's head simply stopped. She had expected a monster, and in some ways, she supposed he was. One, powerfully built, with the kind of stillness that only comes from absolute control, the kind of gaze that made her feel like a mouse standing in the open with a hawk circling above. His eyes were a pale, striking gold, unusual even among wolf shifters, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look at literally anything else in the room. But there was also something else in his face, something Lena hadn't expected and couldn't quite name, an exhaustion that lived somewhere underneath the coldness, like a bruise beneath skin. "You're the Thornfield healer," he said. His voice was low, even, unhurried. It did not sound cruel. It sounded like a man who had simply stopped expecting anything interesting to happen to him. "Yes, Your Majesty." Lena's own voice came out steadier than she felt. She dropped into the bow Rosalind had rushed to teach her in the corridor outside, the specific bow reserved for the sovereign, spine straight, eyes briefly lowered, and then raised again. "Lena Hartley, of Thornfield. My cousin tells me you saved her life." He studied her the way someone might study a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture they expected. "She says the royal physicians would have arrived too late. She says you knew which herbs to use before they even finished writing their reports." "I've treated injuries like hers before, Your Majesty. Hunting accidents are common where I live." "And yet you seem frightened of blood." His eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the door the kneeling man had been dragged through. "You flinched, in the corridor." Lena's chest tightened. She hadn't realized he'd been told about that. Hadn't realized anyone had been watching her reaction closely enough to report it. "I flinch at cruelty, Your Majesty. Not at blood." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and the moment they did, she felt the entire room go very quiet in a different way than before. Not tense, exactly, but startled, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something nobody expected to hear spoken aloud in front of the throne. For a long moment, the king said nothing at all. His gold eyes stayed on her face, unreadable, and Lena felt sweat gather at the base of her spine, despite the cool stone floor beneath her. She had just, on her very first night in the palace, implied that her king was cruel. She thought of every story she had ever heard about people who displeased him, about silent dismissals through side doors, about punishments that were decided and carried out without a single word of explanation to anyone watching. Then, astonishingly, one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make several of the nearby nobles exchange quick, disbelieving glances. "Careful, healer," he said quietly. "Honesty is a rare currency in this hall. I haven't decided yet if I find it refreshing or foolish. Perhaps it can be both, Your Majesty." This time the corner of his mouth moved further, and somewhere behind Lena, she heard a noble actually gasp, quiet and quickly stifled. "You will stay in the palace," the king said, straightening slightly in his throne, his voice shifting back into the flat, commanding tone he'd used with the kneeling man. "You will be assigned quarters near the infirmary, and given a position under the royal physicians. Lady Priya's life is worth more to this crown than gold, and I do not waste useful people by sending them home." It was not a request. Lena understood that immediately. Whatever plans she'd had for returning to Thornfield after a polite thank you and a few days' rest had just been quietly erased by 2 fingers lifting from the arm of a throne. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, because there was truly nothing else to say. "Rosalind will see to your quarters." His gaze held hers for one more moment, something unreadable passing behind those striking gold eyes, and then he looked away, already dismissing her from his attention, already turning toward the next matter waiting in a long evening full of matters. "That is all." Lena backed away the way she'd seen the fleeing courtiers do earlier, 3 steps before turning, and only once she was moving back down the long aisle did she let herself breathe properly again. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of the court starting up once more, voices rising and falling like water finding its level after a stone has been thrown in and sunk. Rosalind met her at the doors with an expression Lena couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprise and warning. "You spoke to him like that on your first night," Rosalind said under her breath as they walked, and he almost smiled. "Do you understand what you just did?" "I don't understand any of this," Lena admitted honestly. "I've been here less than an hour." That man has not smiled in front of the full court in 6 years. 6 years, healer. People have tried everything. Gifts, poetry, political favors, their own daughters. And you did it by accident by telling him he was cruel. Rosalind shook her head slowly as they turned down a quieter corridor, torchlight flickering against tapestries of hunting wolves. "You are either the luckiest woman in this palace or the most doomed. I genuinely cannot tell which yet." Lena thought about those pale gold eyes, the exhaustion buried beneath the coldness, the way his voice had softened by the smallest possible degree when he called her honesty refreshing instead of foolish. She thought about the bleeding man dragged out a side door with 2 fingers and no explanation. "Can it not be both?" she asked quietly, echoing her own words back to herself. Rosalind actually laughed at that, short and surprised. "Sun and moon, I think you might survive here after all." They reached a small chamber near the infirmary wing, plain, but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the palace gardens rather than the execution yard, which Rosalind pointed out was apparently a significant mercy. Lena sat on the edge of the bed once she was alone, her satchel of herbs still clutched in her lap, and finally allowed her hands to shake the way they had wanted to since she first saw the blood on the corridor floor. She had come to the capital expecting one night of thanks and a quick return home to the quiet, predictable rhythms of Thornfield. Birthing fevers, dislocated shoulders, the occasional hunting wound. Instead, she had been claimed by the crown itself, assigned to serve at the very heart of the most feared court in the kingdom, and she had done it by accidentally insulting a man whose growl alone was rumored to have ended a rebellion. Down the corridor, through the thick stone walls, she thought she could still hear the low murmur of the throne room, the king's voice occasionally rising above the rest, flat and controlled and utterly unreadable. She did not know, sitting there in the fading evening light with her herbs still clutched against her chest, that within the month, she would say something far more dangerous than calling him cruel. She did not know that the next words to leave her mouth in front of that entire silk-clad, gossip-hungry court would not be honest, and would not be careful, and would change absolutely everything. For now, she only knew that she was tired, that she was far from home, and that somewhere beyond her window, in a throne room built from black stone and old fear, a king with pale gold eyes had almost smiled at her, and she had no idea yet what that almost smile was going to cost her, or give her, in the days that were about to come. The infirmary was already full when Lena arrived for her first shift, and nobody bothered to explain the rules to her before throwing her into the middle of them. "You, new girl, hold this." A physician named Edmund Voss, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the permanently harried look of someone who had not slept properly in years, shoved a roll of bandages into her hands, without looking up from the soldier bleeding on the table in front of him. "Border patrol skirmish. Wolf claw wounds. Deep. I need pressure on his side while I stitch." Lena didn't argue. She pressed the bandage against the wound the way she'd done 100 times in Thornfield, and within minutes, she and Edmund had fallen into the wordless rhythm that experienced healers find with each other, passing instruments back and forth, anticipating each other's next move. By the time the soldier was stitched and sedated, Edmund was looking at her with something closer to respect than the dismissive irritation he'd started with. "Priya was right about you," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Where did you train?" "My mother, and her mother before her. We don't have a physician's guild in Thornfield, just people who know how to fix what breaks. That's more than half these city-trained fools know how to do." Edmund nodded toward the row of cots along the far wall, most of them empty for now, the calm before what he called the evening rush. "You'll be assigned to general care, Redistu. Cuts, fevers, training injuries, the occasional poisoning attempt from someone's overambitious cousin. Try not to die of boredom. She didn't die of boredom. If anything, the weeks that followed moved faster than Lena expected, filled with the small, satisfying work of tending to soldiers and staff, of learning the particular rhythms of a palace that ran on strict hierarchy and quiet fear. She learned which nobles bribed the kitchen staff for information, which guards were kind and which were cruel, which corridors to avoid after dark. She learned, slowly, how to survive somewhere that had once felt entirely alien to her. What she did not expect was how often the king found reasons to walk through the infirmary. The first time, 3 weeks after her arrival, he came in with a shoulder injury from training that any competent healer could have dismissed in minutes. Edmund, strangely, insisted that Lena handle it instead of taking it himself, practically pushing her toward the king with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your Majesty," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral as he settled onto the examination table, shrugging out of the top half of his tunic, with the unbothered ease of a man used to being looked at. She tried very hard not to notice the muscle and old scarring visible across his shoulders and forearms, tried very hard to focus only on the injury itself. "This looks like simple strain, not a tear. You've been overtraining. I train the way I need to train. You'll injure yourself properly if you keep pushing through pain instead of resting it." She pressed careful fingers along the muscle, feeling him tense slightly under her touch, and made herself keep talking in the calm, practical tone she used with every patient. "I can give you something for the inflammation, but if you come back in here in 2 weeks with the same complaint, I'm going to tell Edmund to physically bar you from the training yard." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "You would do that. Bar the king from his own training yard." "I would try, Your Majesty. I make no promises about succeeding." The almost smile returned, the same small movement at the corner of his mouth she'd seen once before, in the throne room, weeks ago. "Rosalind told me you speak to me as though I were an ordinary man. Should I not? Everyone else does not." He studied her for a long moment, gold eyes unusually thoughtful. "It is, as I believe I said once already, refreshing." He came back 4 days later, with no injury at all, claiming a headache that Lena privately suspected did not exist. She gave him a tea for it anyway, made from the same herbs her mother used to brew for tension headaches back home, and he drank it in silence while she cleaned instruments nearby, the quiet between them oddly comfortable rather than strained. "Thornfield," he said eventually, apropos of nothing. "Tell me about it." "It's small, quiet. We have a river that floods every spring, and a market that sells the same 6 vegetables all year." She smiled slightly, surprising herself. "It's nothing like this place." "That sounds pleasant." "It sounds boring, Your Majesty." Boring can be its own kind of pleasant, when you have spent your entire life somewhere that is never, ever quiet. He said it simply, without any obvious self-pity. But Lena caught something underneath the words, something she was starting to recognize as a pattern in him. Brief cracks in the controlled exterior, gone almost as soon as they appeared. These visits became a strange, unspoken routine over the following weeks. He would find an excuse, a minor ache, a request for herbs to help him sleep. Once, absurdly, a splinter that any child could have removed himself, and Lena would tend to it while they talked about nothing important and everything important at once. She learned that he had taken the throne young, after his father's death, and that he rarely spoke of his father at all. She learned that he ate dinner alone most nights, a fact that startled her the first time he mentioned it so casually, as though it were unremarkable, rather than deeply sad. She learned that he never removed the leather gloves he wore even indoors, and when she asked why once, gently, he simply changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been avoiding that particular question for a very long time. She learned, too, though she tried hard not to notice it, that she had started looking forward to the sound of his footsteps in the infirmary corridor, a rhythm she could now pick out from a dozen others. "You're doing it again," Edmund said one evening, not looking up from the ledger he was updating, as Lena watched the door a full minute after the king had left following another one of his invented ailments. "Doing what?" "Smiling like that, after he leaves." Edmund finally glanced up, his expression not unkind, but careful. "Be mindful, Lena. Whatever this is, and I genuinely do not know what it is, because I have worked in this infirmary for 11 years, and I have never once seen him visit more than twice in a season, it is being noticed. By more people than just me. It's nothing. He has aches. I treat them. He has no aches. Priya told me herself he trains harder than any 3 soldiers combined, and has never once complained of pain in the 6 years I've known him. Edmund set down his pen, his voice dropping lower, more serious. I am not warning you because I think you've done anything wrong. I am warning you because this court eats gentle things for breakfast, and whatever is happening between the two of you, gentle is exactly what it looks like from where I'm standing. Lena didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it long after Edmund had gone to bed, lying awake in her narrow room with the window cracked open to the summer night air, turning his warning over in her mind, the way she might examine an unfamiliar herb, trying to determine whether it was medicine or poison. She thought about the way the king's shoulders had relaxed, incrementally, every single time he sat down in her infirmary. She thought about the exhaustion she'd noticed underneath his coldness on that very first night, and how she'd started to see, more and more clearly, what caused it. Not weakness, but loneliness, vast and carefully hidden loneliness, the kind that comes from spending 6 years as a symbol instead of a person. She thought, too, about the growing whispers she'd started to catch in the palace corridors, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she walked past, sideways glances from nobles who had never once looked directly at a border village healer before her name became attached, however quietly, to the king's. Something was shifting in the palace, slow and unstoppable as a tide coming in, and Lena did not yet understand how deep the water was going to get before she noticed she could no longer touch the bottom. 3 nights later, exhausted from a long shift, treating an outbreak of summer fever among the kitchen staff, half asleep on her feet, after nearly 18 hours without rest, Lena was summoned without warning to the receiving hall for the arrival of a foreign delegation. She had not slept properly in 2 days. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges as Rosalind rushed her into a clean healer's uniform and pushed her toward the hall, muttering something about protocol, requiring the king's personal physician staff to be present for formal greetings. She stumbled into the receiving hall at the very back of a small crowd of palace officials, barely upright, the noise of the room washing over her in a formless blur. Somewhere near the front, the king stood in full formal dress, greeting the visiting delegation with the same flat, controlled authority he brought to everything. She caught fragments of conversation, nothing that made sense through her exhaustion, and focused mostly on staying vertical. Then, from somewhere near his feet, low and rough, she heard it. A warning growl, sharp and sudden, cutting through the formal murmur of the hall. Lena's exhausted mind, running purely on instinct built from years of tending injured animals in Thornfield, alongside injured people, did not process the sound as coming from a king. It processed the sound as coming from something small and hurt and afraid, the exact tone of a frightened, wounded creature she had once nursed back to health after finding it abandoned by the river behind her mother's cottage. Before conscious thought could catch up with instinct, before she even fully understood she was moving, Lena pushed through the crowd toward the sound, dropped to a half-crouch beside the king's leg, and said, in the soft, soothing voice she had used on injured animals her entire life, without any awareness at all of the 24 foreign dignitaries and the entire assembled royal court watching in stunned, frozen silence. It's okay. It's okay, my puppy. Nobody's going to hurt you. The receiving hall went utterly, completely silent. For a long, terrible moment, nobody in the receiving hall moved at all. Lena's exhausted mind finally caught up with what her body had already done, and the realization hit her like cold water thrown in her face. She was crouched on the floor of the formal receiving hall, in front of the entire visiting delegation, in front of the assembled royal court, having just called the Alpha King of the realm, my puppy, in a soft, soothing voice, usually reserved for frightened animals. She looked up slowly. King Damian Ashwood was staring down at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not the cold control she'd come to expect, but something closer to pure, undiluted shock, as though she had struck him across the face rather than spoken 4 soft words. Somewhere behind her, a foreign dignitary made a small, strangled sound that might have been the beginning of laughter, quickly and wisely suppressed. a noblewoman near the front, actually dropped her fan. Rosalind, standing near the doorway, had both hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes enormous. Lena scrambled upright, her face burning, her mind racing through every possible way to explain herself, and finding absolutely nothing that would make this better. "Your Majesty, she started, and then had no idea how to finish the sentence, because there was no version of, "I mistook your warning growl for an injured animal, and called you a puppy in front of a foreign delegation," that improved the situation in any way. The king said nothing. He simply looked at her, gold eyes wide in a way she had never seen them before, something unreadable moving behind them, and the silence stretched so long and so completely that Lena genuinely began to wonder if she was about to become the shortest-serving palace healer in the kingdom's history. Then, astonishingly, the foreign delegation's lead ambassador, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, curious eyes, cleared her throat delicately into the silence. "Your Majesty," she said, with the careful diplomacy of someone who had spent decades learning to navigate exactly this kind of impossible moment, "perhaps we might continue the formal proceedings." It was, Lena would think later, possibly the single greatest act of mercy anyone had shown her in her entire time at the palace. The king seemed to physically pull himself back into the moment, his expression sliding back into its familiar controlled mask so quickly that Lena might have imagined the shock she'd seen a moment before, if she hadn't been staring directly at his face when it happened. "Of course," he said, his voice flat and even, giving absolutely nothing away. "Forgive the interruption." He did not look at Lena again for the rest of the formal greeting. She stood at the very back of the hall for the remainder of the ceremony, her whole body rigid with humiliation, watching the king conduct himself with perfect, icy composure, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a border village healer had not just called him a puppy in front of an entire visiting delegation. The moment the ceremony ended, Lena did not wait to be dismissed. She fled. She made it halfway down the corridor toward the infirmary before Rosalind caught up with her, grabbing her arm and pulling her into an alcove behind a heavy tapestry, out of sight of the passing courtiers who were already, Lena could hear, whispering excitedly to each other about what had just happened in the receiving hall. "Are you trying to get yourself executed?" Rosalind hissed, though there was something in her expression that looked almost like barely contained laughter, fighting with genuine alarm. "Lena, my puppy. You called the Alpha King my puppy. In front of the entire Velmoran delegation." "I know what I did." Lena pressed both hands over her face, mortification burning through every inch of her body. "I hadn't slept in 2 days, Rosalind. I heard the growl and my body just reacted. I've spent my whole life around injured animals. It was instinct, not thought. I believe you, completely. But I promise you, nobody in that hall is going to care whether it was instinct or a deliberate insult. What they're going to care about is that the Alpha King, the man who has not smiled in public in 6 years, the man whose growl once stopped an entire rebellion, was just called a puppy by a border healer in front of a foreign delegation, and did not have her removed from the room." Lena lowered her hands slowly, the full weight of that observation finally settling into place. "He didn't have me removed." "No." Rosalind's expression turned genuinely thoughtful now, the alarm giving way to something more curious. "He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at you again, which honestly might be worse, but he also didn't call the guards, didn't have you dragged out through a side door, the way I've seen him deal with far smaller offenses. Do you understand what that means? That he's saving the punishment for somewhere more private? Maybe." Rosalind chewed her lip, glancing back down the corridor toward the sound of approaching footsteps, and quickly ushering Lena further back into the shadowed alcove. "Or maybe it means something else entirely. I've served this palace for 9 years, Lena. I've seen him execute traitors without raising his voice. I've seen him dismiss ambassadors mid-sentence for far smaller slights than what just happened in that hall. Whatever this is between the two of you, it is not ordinary, and it has not been ordinary since the night you arrived." The footsteps in the corridor grew closer, and Rosalind's whole body went suddenly tense, her hand tightening on Lena's arm. Through a gap in the tapestry, Lena caught a glimpse of dark formal robes passing by, unmistakably the king himself, walking alone and unusually fast, his expression a rigid mask that gave nothing away to the courtiers, scrambling to get out of his path. He did not stop. He did not look toward the alcove. He simply walked past, disappearing around the far corner, and the tension in Rosalind's shoulders slowly eased. "I need to go back to the infirmary," Lena said quietly, once the corridor had fallen silent again. "I need to work. I need to do something normal before I lose my mind entirely." Edmund took one look at her face when she returned, and, mercifully, did not ask any questions, simply handed her a stack of supply inventories to organize, and let her work in silence for the rest of the evening. Word of the receiving hall incident had apparently already spread through the palace with the speed of wildfire, because every servant who passed through the infirmary that night gave her a look, some amused, some scandalized, a few genuinely sympathetic, that told her everyone already knew exactly what had happened. By the time her shift finally ended, well past midnight, Lena was so exhausted she could barely see straight, and she made her way back to her small chamber, with only one thought in her mind: sleep, and the fervent hope that she would wake up tomorrow to find the entire humiliating incident had somehow already been forgotten. She did not get her wish. A folded note was waiting on her narrow bed when she arrived, sealed with the royal crest pressed into dark wax, a mark she had only seen once before, on the summons that had first brought her to the palace weeks ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, half convinced she was about to read her own dismissal, or worse. The note was short, written in a controlled, precise hand. "Come to the private garden at dawn. Tell no one." There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. Lena sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, holding the note in both hands, her exhaustion warring with a sharp, nervous curiosity she could not quite suppress. Whatever waited for her in that garden at dawn, she understood with growing certainty, was going to change something. She simply did not yet know whether it would be for the better or for the worse, and as she finally lay down, unable to fully close her eyes, she realized that some small, foolish part of her was almost looking forward to finding out. The private garden was nothing like the formal gardens Lena had glimpsed from her window. It sat behind a wall she hadn't even known existed, accessible only through a narrow gate that a silent guard unlocked for her without a word, and it was wild in a way the rest of the palace was not. Untrimmed roses, climbing over an old stone bench, herbs growing in loose, unplanned clusters that reminded her sharply of home, a small pond with actual frogs calling out in the pale gray light before sunrise. The king was already there when she arrived, standing with his back to her, looking out over the pond with his hands clasped behind him. He had changed out of his formal robes into something simpler, a plain dark tunic without any royal markings at all, and for a moment, seeing him like this, unguarded and alone in the quiet garden light, Lena understood with sudden clarity why Rosalind had warned her that this was not ordinary. "You came," he said, without turning around. "You told me not to tell anyone, Your Majesty. I assumed that meant I should come." That earned her the smallest exhale of something that might have been amusement. He turned to face her finally, and in the soft dawn light, without the weight of the throne room or the formal receiving hall pressing down on him, he looked younger than she had ever seen him, and more tired. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for my silence yesterday. It was not the reaction you deserved, and I imagine it left you frightened for your position, possibly for your life. I assumed I was going to be executed," Lena admitted honestly, "or at minimum, sent back to Thornfield in disgrace. Neither of those things is going to happen." He gestured toward the stone bench, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat, and he sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool morning air. "What you said yesterday, I have been trying to understand, since it happened, why it affected me the way it did. I think I finally understand it now, and I think you deserve to understand it too, since you were the one who caused it." Lena said nothing, waiting, some instinct telling her that whatever came next mattered more than almost anything he had said to her in all their previous conversations combined. "When I was very young," he began slowly, each word chosen with obvious care, "before I understood what it meant to be heir to this throne, my father kept a wolf pup, not a shifted wolf, an actual, ordinary pup, found abandoned in the eastern forests during a hunting expedition. He was not, by that point in his life, a gentle man. But he was gentle with that pup, genuinely, uncomplicatedly gentle, in a way I never once saw him be with me, or with my mother, or with anyone else in this entire palace. His hands, Lena noticed, had curled slightly against his knees, the leather gloves he always wore creaking faintly with the tension. I used to watch them together, when I was small. He would sit exactly where we're sitting now, and the pup would climb into his lap, and he would speak to it, in this soft voice I never heard him use for anything or anyone else. I remember being jealous of an animal. I remember thinking, even at that age, that whatever made my father capable of that kind of gentleness, I clearly did not possess it, because he never once spoke to me that way. Damien. His name left her mouth before she could stop it, no title attached, and she felt him go very still beside her. My father believed gentleness was a weakness that could be trained out of a person, he continued, his voice dropping lower, rougher. He believed it, and eventually, he decided to prove it. I was 12 years old when he had the pup killed in front of me. A lesson, he called it. He told me that a king who loved something soft would eventually be destroyed by someone who understood that softness was a door left open. Lena felt something cold settle in her chest, a horror she carefully kept from showing on her face, some instinct telling her that sympathy right now would close him off rather than open him further. That's not a lesson, she said quietly. That's cruelty wearing the mask of wisdom. I know that now. I did not know it then. He finally looked at her directly, gold eyes raw and more open than she had ever seen them. I have not heard anyone speak to anything, or anyone, with that kind of unguarded gentleness since that day. Not until you knelt beside me in the receiving hall, half asleep on your feet, and spoke to me exactly the way my father used to speak to that pup, before I understood what I was about to lose. Lena's throat tightened, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. I didn't know, she whispered. If I had known, I never would have. Don't apologize. His voice was firm, almost urgent. That is precisely what I wanted to say to you this morning. Do not apologize for the single kindest thing anyone has said to me in 18 years. I have spent 6 years on that throne, being feared, being obeyed, being watched for weakness by every noble house that would gladly see me fall. I had genuinely forgotten what it sounded like, to be spoken to, as though I were something worth being gentle with. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the frogs still calling from the pond, the first real light of morning starting to spill golden over the garden wall. Lena reached out, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away, and rested her hand lightly over his gloved one, where it sat against his knee. He didn't pull away. Why the gloves? She asked softly. You never take them off, not even indoors. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that this particular door, unlike the one about his father, would remain firmly shut. But then, quietly, the same day my father had the pup killed, I lost control of my shift for the first time. Grief and rage, more than I'd ever felt at that age. I hurt someone, a servant who tried to comfort me. His jaw tightened. I have worn gloves ever since, as a reminder. Hands that cannot be trusted should be covered. That's not fair to yourself, Lena said, her hand tightening gently over his. You were 12 years old, grieving something you weren't allowed to grieve openly. A child losing control after watching something like that isn't proof you can't be trusted. It's proof you were a child who needed comfort and was given cruelty instead. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, some old, carefully guarded wall cracking just slightly at the edges. You have a dangerous habit, he said finally, of making things I have believed for 18 years suddenly sound foolish. I have a dangerous habit of telling the truth, Your Majesty. You mentioned once it was a rare currency here. Damien, he corrected quietly. When we are here, in this garden, you may call me Damien. Something warm bloomed in Lena's chest, something she knew. Even in that moment, she probably shouldn't allow herself to feel toward a king who could never truly be simply a man to her. Not in any way the rest of the world would recognize or accept. But sitting there in the pale gold morning light, his hand still beneath hers, the wild roses breathing their scent into the cool air around them, she found she couldn't quite make herself care about what the rest of the world would think. Damien, she repeated softly, testing the shape of it. Thank you for trusting me with this. Thank you for the puppy comment, he said. And there, finally, unmistakably, was the almost smile again, wider than she had ever seen it, warm enough to reach all the way into his gold eyes. I believe it may have been the most honest moment of my entire reign. Lena laughed, surprised and delighted despite everything, and the sound of it seemed to startle something loose in him too, because he laughed as well. Quiet, rusty, clearly unused, but real. For just a moment, in the private garden behind a wall, the rest of the palace didn't know existed. They were not king and healer, not alpha and subject. They were simply two people, sharing a quiet dawn, and something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadow of the garden gate, a young page boy sent to deliver an unrelated message, who had frozen at the sight of his king laughing, actually laughing, with the border healer everyone in the palace was already whispering about. The boy backed away slowly, careful and silent, already turning over in his mind exactly who would pay the most silver for what he had just seen. By midday, the story would reach the ears of Duke Callum Whitmore, and the quiet, private morning in the garden would become the first thread in a plot that neither Lena nor Damien yet knew was already beginning to take shape around them. Duke Callum Whitmore was not a man who wasted good information, and the page boy's whispered account of a laughing king in a private garden was very good information indeed. He turned the story over carefully in the privacy of his study that evening, a glass of dark wine untouched at his elbow, his sharp mind already sketching out the shape of an opportunity. Callum had spent 11 years positioning himself as the second most powerful man in the kingdom, carefully cultivating alliances among the noble houses, waiting patiently for the moment when King Damien's iron control might finally show a crack wide enough to exploit. A border healer who could make the untouchable Alpha King laugh in a private garden, that was not a crack, that was an open door. Interesting, he murmured to himself, swirling the wine slowly. Very interesting indeed. He was not the only one who found it interesting. Within 2 weeks of the garden dawn, the whole palace had noticed the change in Lena's status, even if nobody could name exactly what had shifted. The king's visits to the infirmary grew more frequent rather than less, no longer disguised as anything resembling medical necessity. He simply came, sat, and talked with her, while she worked, and increasingly, other courtiers began finding reasons of their own to linger nearby, watching, cataloging, calculating what her rising influence might mean for their own positions. Lena felt the shift in how people treated her, almost immediately. Servants who had barely acknowledged her a month ago now greeted her with careful, deferential nods. Nobles who would never have spoken to a border healer began finding excuses to strike up conversation in the corridors, their questions probing and thinly disguised as pleasantries. Even Edmund had grown more careful around her, though his affection remained genuine, tempered now with a worry she caught in his eyes whenever the king's visits ran long. "You should be careful with him," Rosalind told her one evening, helping Lena fold linens in the small storage room off the infirmary, her voice pitched low despite the empty hallway beyond the door. "Not because I think his feelings aren't real. I think they very obviously are. But feelings from a king are not the same as feelings from an ordinary man, Lena. When he cares about something, everyone around that thing becomes a target. A target for what? For anyone who wants to hurt him without touching him directly." Rosalind's expression was grave. "Duke Whitmore has been asking questions about you. Small ones, careful ones, the kind that seem harmless on their own, but add up to someone building a complete picture. I don't like it." Lena's hands stilled over the linens. "What kind of questions?" "Where you're really from. Whether Thornfield has ever had trouble with the crown before, any old grudges, any family debts, whether you have any relatives who might benefit from your closeness to the king." Rosalind shook her head slowly. "He's not asking because he's curious about you, Lena. He's asking because he's looking for a weakness he can use." The warning settled uneasily in Lena's chest, and she found herself thinking of it again 3 days later, when a summons arrived requesting her presence in the royal council chamber, not from the king, but from the council itself, a body of 8 senior nobles who oversaw the kingdom's affairs alongside the crown. She had never been summoned by the council directly before, and the formal, cold wording of the note did nothing to ease her nerves as she made her way through the palace toward the chamber. The council room was smaller than the throne room, but somehow felt colder. 8 seats arranged in a half circle, facing a single chair positioned in the center of the floor, clearly meant for whoever was being questioned. Duke Whitmore sat at the center of the council's arc, his expression carefully neutral, his sharp eyes tracking Lena's every movement as she took her seat. "Healer Hartley," he began, his voice smooth and pleasant in a way that immediately put her on guard. "Thank you for coming. We have some questions regarding your rapid rise in status within the palace, and we felt it prudent to address them directly, Healer to council, rather than allow rumor to fill the silence." "Of course," Lena said carefully. "I'll answer whatever I can." "Excellent." Callum steepled his fingers, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let us begin with something simple. How would you characterize your relationship with His Majesty?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through the watching council. Lena felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice level, drawing on every ounce of the calm composure Rosalind had been drilling into her for weeks. "His Majesty has been kind to me, Your Grace. I treat his minor injuries, as I do for many members of the palace staff and guard." "Minor injuries," Callum repeated thoughtfully, "that seem to require rather lengthy consultations, and private garden meetings at dawn, unaccompanied, which I understand have become something of a regular occurrence." Lena's stomach dropped. She had not told anyone about the garden. Rosalind had known, but Rosalind would never have spoken of it to the council. Someone else had been watching. Someone else had been reporting. "His Majesty asked to speak with me privately," she said carefully. "I did not feel it was my place to refuse a royal request, nor to question his reasons for making it. No, of course not." Callum's smile widened slightly, and Lena had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of a predator that had just confirmed its prey was exactly where it wanted it to be. "I mean no accusation, Healer. I simply wish to understand the nature of an influence that has grown remarkably quickly, and remarkably close to the throne, in a very short span of time. The Council has a responsibility to ensure that the Crown's decisions remain sound, uninfluenced by attachments that might cloud good judgment. With respect, Your Grace, I have never once attempted to influence His Majesty's decisions on any matter of state. I am a healer. I treat wounds and fevers. I have no interest in politics." "And yet politics," said another council member, an older woman with cold gray eyes, "has a way of finding people regardless of their interest in it, Healer. Particularly people who find themselves suddenly, unexpectedly close to the most powerful man in the kingdom." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, circling the same territory again and again from slightly different angles, each council member taking their turn probing at her origins, her intentions, her family, her possible motives. Lena answered every question as honestly and as carefully as she could, but by the time the council finally dismissed her, her hands were trembling, and her voice had gone hoarse from the strain of remaining composed. She made it exactly to the corridor outside before her legs gave out slightly, and she had to steady herself against the cold stone wall, breathing hard, the full weight of what had just happened finally crashing over her. This was not simple curiosity. This was the beginning of something organized, something deliberate, and she understood, with sudden, sick clarity, that Rosalind's warning had not been an exaggeration. She had become a target, exactly as predicted, and she had no idea yet how far Duke Whitmore was willing to go to remove her from the board entirely. Word of the council's questioning reached Damien within the hour, and by the time he found her in the infirmary that evening, his expression was darker than Lena had ever seen it. Not the controlled coldness of the throne room, but something rawer, angrier, more dangerous. "They summoned you without my knowledge," he said, his voice low and tight with barely contained fury. "The council does not have the authority to interrogate palace staff without royal consent. This was a deliberate overstep, and I intend to address it directly." "Damien, please." Lena caught his arm before he could turn and storm toward the council chamber, some instinct telling her that a furious confrontation right now would only make things worse, would only confirm every suspicion the council had already voiced about his judgment being clouded. "If you go in there like this, you'll only prove their point, that your feelings for me are affecting your ability to rule with a clear head." He stopped, his jaw working, gold eyes blazing with a fury that made him look, for just a moment, exactly like the terrifying Alpha King the stories had always described. They have no right to interrogate you as though you were a criminal, as though caring about someone honest and good makes me somehow unfit to sit on my own throne. I know that. But you proving them wrong by staying calm will do far more good than you proving them right by losing your temper on their behalf. Lena kept her voice steady, her hand still firm on his arm, and slowly, gradually, she felt some of the tension drain from him, his shoulders lowering by degrees. Let me handle this my way. For now, I can survive a council's questions. What I need is for you to trust that I can. He looked down at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective and unmistakably tender warring behind his eyes. I do trust you, he said quietly. It is Whitmore I do not trust, and it is Whitmore I intend to watch very, very closely from this point forward. Neither of them yet knew how right that instinct would prove to be, or how quickly Duke Whitmore's careful, patient scheming was about to escalate from questions asked in a cold council chamber into something considerably more dangerous. A plot that would not simply question Lena's place in the palace, but attempt to remove her from it entirely, by any means necessary. The order came down 3 days later, delivered not by the council directly, but through a formal writ carried to the infirmary by 2 palace guards Lena had never seen before, men wearing the council's own insignia rather than the king's, a detail she noted with a growing sense of unease, even before she'd finished reading the parchment they handed her. By decree of the Royal Council, effective immediately, the healer Lena Hartley is to be relieved of her palace duties and returned to her place of origin, pending review of certain irregularities in her original appointment. Lena read the words 3 times before their meaning fully settled into place. Irregularities, she repeated slowly, looking up at the guards. What irregularities? We were not told, healer, one of the guards said, not unkindly. Only instructed to escort you to gather your belongings and prepare for departure by morning. Edmund, standing nearby with a tray of instruments he'd frozen holding the moment the guards arrived, set it down with a sharp clatter. This is absurd. She saved Lady Priya's life. She has served faithfully for weeks without a single complaint against her work. Our orders come from the council, physician, not from us. We simply carry out what we are given. Lena's mind raced, cycling rapidly through everything Rosalind had warned her about, everything the council's cold, probing questions had hinted at 3 days earlier. This was not a coincidence. This was Duke Whitmore's next move, executed with the same careful, deliberate patience he'd shown in the council chamber, and this time, he clearly intended to remove her from the palace entirely before she could become any more of a problem. I need to speak with someone, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. Before I'm escorted anywhere, this decree affects my appointment, which was made directly by His Majesty. Surely I have some right to. The council has full authority over staff appointments in matters of irregularity, the second guard said, his tone apologetic but firm. I'm sorry, healer, we have our orders. They did not drag her, exactly, but the escort to her chamber felt uncomfortably close to it, the guards flanking her on either side, as though she might attempt to flee or cause some kind of scene. Word spread through the palace with its usual terrifying speed, and by the time Lena reached her small room, a small crowd of curious and sympathetic staff had already gathered in the corridor outside, whispering among themselves, several of them looking genuinely distressed on her behalf. She had barely begun gathering her few belongings, the small collection of herbs and instruments she'd brought from Thornfield, the modest clothing Rosalind had helped her acquire over the past weeks, when the corridor outside erupted into a different kind of noise entirely, the unmistakable sound of the king's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a blade. Where is she? The guards outside her door straightened immediately, and Lena heard the crowd part, footsteps approaching fast. Damien appeared in her doorway a moment later, still dressed in the plain tunic he wore for evening training, his expression a mixture of fury and something rawer underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. You're not leaving, he said, before she could speak. Whatever writ they handed you, it holds no authority. I am rescinding it personally, effective immediately. Your Majesty, one of the escort guards began carefully. The council's decree states clearly that. The council, Damien said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous that made every person in the corridor go instantly, completely silent. Does not have the authority to override a direct appointment made by the Crown. I made this appointment. I did not consult the council when I made it, and I do not require their permission to maintain it now. He crossed the small room to stand directly in front of Lena, his hands coming up to rest gently on her shoulders, gold eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache. Are you unharmed? Did they treat you roughly? I'm fine, Damien. Just frightened and confused and angry, mostly. You have every right to be all three. He turned back toward the doorway, toward the small crowd still gathered outside, his voice rising to carry clearly through the corridor, and, Lena suspected, well beyond it, to anyone in the palace who might be listening for exactly this moment. Let it be known, to the council and to every noble house in this palace, that healer Lena Hartley remains under the direct protection of the Crown. Any further attempt to remove her, question her, or interfere with her position, without my explicit consent, will be treated as a direct challenge to royal authority. I trust that is clear enough for everyone to understand. The silence that followed was absolute, and Lena understood, watching the shocked faces of the guards and the gathered staff, that Damien had just done something that no one, not the council, not the whispering courtiers, not even Lena herself, had truly expected him to do. He had defended her, openly, publicly, with the full weight of his authority behind it, breaking whatever careful, distant precedent he had maintained for 6 years of ruling, with icy, untouchable control. He had never, according to every rumor and every whispered story Lena had heard since arriving at the palace, defended anyone this openly before. Not once, in 6 years. Later that night, once the corridor had emptied, and the guards had departed, and the small crowd of staff had dispersed, to spread the story throughout every corner of the palace, Damien found Lena in the quiet of the infirmary, sitting alone amid the familiar clutter of herbs and instruments, still shaken from the events of the evening. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, as he settled onto the bench beside her. You could have simply spoken to me privately, rescinded the order without making such a public spectacle of it. I could have. He was quiet for a moment, his gloved hands loosely folded in his lap. But I have spent 6 years being careful, Lena. Careful about what I show, careful about what I defend, careful about ever letting this court see anything they might exploit as weakness. And in 6 years of careful, controlled distance, I have watched good people be quietly destroyed by men like Whitmore simply because no one was willing to stand publicly in their defense. He turned to look at her, something fierce and unwavering in his gold eyes. I am done being careful about you. Whatever this costs me politically, whatever the council decides to make of it, I would rather stand publicly beside you than watch you be quietly removed, while I hide behind private corrections and careful diplomacy. Lena's throat tightened, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. Damien, I don't want to be the reason your throne becomes unstable. I don't want to be a weapon someone uses against you. You are not a weapon, he said firmly. You are the only genuinely honest thing that has happened to me in 6 years of sitting on that throne, and I refuse to let fear of what Whitmore might do keep me from acknowledging that plainly, in front of anyone who cares to notice. He reached out, gently taking her hand in both of his gloved ones. Let them notice. Let them whisper. I find, increasingly, that I do not care. Outside the infirmary windows, somewhere in the depths of the palace, Duke Whitmore sat alone in his study once more, staring into the dark, turning the evening's events over with the same cold, patient calculation he applied to every setback. The king's public declaration had been a mistake, a serious one, born of exactly the kind of clouded judgment Whitmore had suspected all along. It had also, he reflected slowly, handed him something far more valuable than a quiet dismissal ever could have. The king had just openly, publicly, staked his authority on a border healer's safety in front of the entire palace. All Whitmore needed now was a crime serious enough that even the king's public protection could not save her from it, and he already had several excellent ideas about exactly how to manufacture one. The weeks that followed the council incident brought a fragile kind of peace to the palace, though Lena never fully let herself relax into it. Damien's public declaration had silenced the council's open questioning, at least for now, but she caught the lingering looks from certain nobles whenever she crossed the palace corridors, the careful, calculating glances that told her Duke Whitmore had not abandoned whatever plans he'd been building. He had simply gone quiet, and quiet, she was learning, was often more dangerous than loud. Damien's visits to the infirmary continued, though they no longer bothered with the pretense of minor injuries or invented headaches. He came openly now, sometimes staying for an hour or more while she worked, occasionally bringing meals for them to share in the quiet evening light after the last patients had gone. Rosalind, who had appointed herself Lena's unofficial guardian against palace gossip, took to standing watch outside the infirmary door during these visits, deflecting curious staff with the same brisk efficiency she applied to everything else. "You look happy," Edmund observed one evening, watching Lena hum softly to herself as she organized a shelf of dried herbs, a task she'd done 100 times before but never quite so cheerfully. "It suits you, though I confess I still worry." "I know you do." Lena smiled at him over her shoulder. "But I can't spend every moment of this waiting for the next attack. I have to let myself have some good moments too, don't I?" "You do," Edmund agreed, though his expression remained thoughtful. "I only hope the good moments last longer than the last ones did." His caution proved well-founded, faster than either of them expected. It began, as these things so often did, with a delegation, a trade envoy from the southern kingdom of Velmara, arriving for formal negotiations that would determine the terms of a critical grain agreement, heading into what promised to be a difficult winter. The lead negotiator, a sharp-eyed lord named Alistair Kane, had traveled with a modest retinue, and among his party was a personal attendant who fell suddenly, violently ill on the second night of the negotiations, collapsing during a formal dinner in full view of both delegations. Lena was summoned immediately, along with Edmund and 2 other palace physicians, and the diagnosis, once they'd examined the stricken attendant, was unmistakable and deeply alarming. Poison, administered recently, almost certainly within the palace itself, and almost certainly through the wine served during the dinner. The attendant survived, thanks to swift treatment, but the political damage was already spreading like fire through dry grass. Lord Kane, furious and rightfully suspicious, demanded a full investigation, and demanded it immediately, warning that any further delay would be seen as tacit admission of guilt on the Crown's part. The investigation moved with terrifying speed, and Lena felt the walls closing in around her, before she even fully understood why. It was Edmund who first noticed the pattern in how the questioning was being conducted, his expression growing grimmer with every hour that passed. "They're asking about you specifically," he told her quietly, catching her alone in the infirmary storage room late that night. "Not about the kitchen staff who actually prepared the wine, not about the serving staff who carried it to the table. About you, Lena, about your access to the herbs and substances stored here in the infirmary, about whether you had any opportunity to be near the delegation's private stores before the dinner." Lena's blood ran cold. "I was nowhere near that dinner, Edmund. I was here, treating a training injury for one of the guard captains. You know that. You were here too." "I know it. But knowing it, and proving it to a council, determined to find you guilty, are 2 very different things." Edmund's hands were tense at his sides. "Someone is building a case against you, Lena, and building it carefully. I think you need to prepare yourself for what's coming." What came, 2 days later, was arrest. They came for her at dawn, a full contingent of guards this time, carrying a formal warrant bearing the council's seal, accusing Lena Hartley of the attempted poisoning of a foreign dignitary's attendant, a crime that, if proven, carried a sentence of death by the Crown's own ancient laws. Lena did not resist as they led her from her small chamber in chains, her mind reeling, unable to fully process the speed and totality of the disaster unfolding around her. The dungeon beneath the palace was cold and dark, nothing like the warm, familiar spaces she had come to know over the past months. She sat alone on a narrow stone bench, wrapped in the thin blanket a sympathetic guard had quietly slipped her, and tried desperately to think through what evidence could possibly exist against her, what fabricated proof Duke Whitmore's careful scheming had managed to construct. She did not have to wait long to find out. 2 days into her imprisonment, Rosalind was permitted a brief visit, her face pale and drawn with worry, carrying news that made Lena's stomach drop even further than she'd thought possible. They found traces of the poison in a vial matching your infirmary supplies, Rosalind said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. Hidden in your chamber, behind a loose stone near your bed. Someone planted it there, Lena. It has to have been planted. You would never. I know I would never, but proving that to a council already convinced of my guilt is another matter entirely. Lena's hands trembled in her lap. Where is Damien? Has he tried to see me? Rosalind's expression grew even more troubled. He has been arguing with the council for 2 days straight. They're insisting that as sovereign, he cannot personally intervene in a criminal matter involving evidence found against the accused, that doing so would set a precedent that undermines the rule of law itself. It's Whitmore's doing, of course. He's using the very laws Damien's own father established to tie his hands. Lena closed her eyes, exhaustion and fear and grief warring inside her. Then I suppose I'll simply have to trust that he finds a way through it. She did not have to wait much longer to find out whether that trust was well placed. On the 4th day of her imprisonment, the dungeon door opened to reveal not a guard, but Damien himself, moving past the startled jailer with the kind of controlled fury Lena had only seen once before, on the night he'd defended her in the corridor outside her chamber. I have spent 4 days going through every piece of evidence in this case personally, he said, crouching down outside her cell, his gold eyes blazing with an intensity that made the surrounding shadows seem to retreat. The vial found in your chamber does not match the poison found in the attendant's blood. Different composition entirely. My physicians confirmed it this morning, independently, without knowing why I was asking. Lena's heart leapt. Then, someone made a mistake, planting evidence they assumed would go unquestioned by a council, eager for a quick resolution. His jaw tightened. I also found something else, a record of payment, made 3 weeks ago, from Duke Whitmore's personal accounts, to a kitchen servant, who has since disappeared entirely from the palace. The timing aligns precisely with when the poison would have needed to be acquired. You found proof, Lena breathed, hardly daring to believe it. I found proof, Damien confirmed, and I intend to present it to the full council and both delegations tomorrow morning, in the most public setting I can arrange. Whitmore has spent months building his case against you in shadows and whispers. I intend to unmake it in front of everyone who ever listened to those whispers. Lena reached through the bars, and he took her hand immediately, gripping it tight, some of the fierce tension in his shoulders easing at the simple contact. Thank you, she whispered, for not giving up on me. I would burn this entire palace to its foundations before I let them take you from me over a lie, he said quietly, fiercely, and in the flickering torchlight of the dungeon, Lena believed every single word of it completely. The receiving hall was fuller than Lena had ever seen it when the guards led her in the following morning, still in chains, flanked by 2 silent escorts, as the entire assembled council, both delegations, and what looked like half the palace's noble houses, watched her slow walk toward the center of the room, with expressions ranging from open hostility to cautious curiosity. Duke Whitmore stood near the front of the gathered council, his expression carefully composed, though Lena caught the faintest flicker of unease crossing his features as she was brought forward. He had not, she suspected, expected the king to demand this level of public spectacle for what should have been a straightforward confirmation of guilt. Damien sat upon his throne, dressed in full formal regalia, his expression a mask of controlled authority that gave nothing away to the watching crowd. Only Lena, who had come to know the small signs of tension in his shoulders and jaw over the past months, could see the coiled fury simmering just beneath that careful composure. 4 days ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, the healer Lena Hartley was arrested on charges of attempted poisoning against a foreign dignitary's attendant. The evidence presented against her was a vial of poison discovered hidden in her personal chamber. I have spent those 4 days personally investigating this evidence, alongside my own physicians, and, where necessary, independent examination by members of the visiting delegation itself. He gestured, and Edmund stepped forward from where he'd been waiting near the dais, carrying a small wooden case that he opened for the assembled court to see. 2 vials, side by side, their contents subtly but visibly different in color and texture. The poison found in the attendant's blood, and the poison found in the vial planted in Healer Hartley's chamber are not the same substance, Damien continued, his voice hardening. This has been confirmed independently by 3 separate physicians, including one selected directly by Lord Kane's own delegation, to ensure there could be no accusation of bias in these findings. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall, and Lena watched Duke Whitmore's expression tighten almost imperceptibly, his careful composure beginning, for the first time, to show cracks. Furthermore, Damien went on, nodding toward another figure who stepped forward, a guard captain Lena recognized as Garrett Poole, carrying a leather folder of documents. I have obtained financial records showing a payment made 3 weeks prior to the poisoning, from Duke Whitmore's personal accounts, to a kitchen servant named Bertram Wick, who vanished from palace employment the very night of the incident and has not been seen since. The murmurs in the hall grew louder now, several council members exchanging alarmed glances, and Duke Whitmore's face had gone visibly pale, though he still maintained enough composure to speak, his voice tight with forced calm. Your Majesty, I must object to this line of accusation. Financial transactions can have any number of innocent explanations. To suggest that I would orchestrate, the transaction is recorded as payment for information regarding infirmary storage practices, Damien cut in, his voice cold and precise as a blade. Information that would be necessary for anyone attempting to plant evidence within the infirmary's supply chain or within a specific individual's chamber, without detection. I would very much like to hear your innocent explanation for that particular detail, Duke Whitmore. The silence that followed was absolute, thick and suffocating, every eye in the hall now fixed on the Duke rather than on Lena. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed once, twice, no ready answer forming quickly enough to save him from the accusation hanging in the air. I did not act alone, he finally said, his voice tight, and Lena felt a fresh wave of shock ripple through the hall at the admission. I acted in the interest of the crown's stability, Your Majesty. Your attachment to this healer has clouded your judgment for months. I sought only to remove an influence that threatened the security of your reign. You sought to murder an innocent woman through poison and false accusation in order to preserve your own political standing, Damien said, rising slowly from his throne, his voice carrying the full weight of 6 years of careful, controlled authority now finally, fully unleashed. You endangered a foreign dignitary's life, risked a diplomatic incident that could have collapsed critical trade negotiations, and attempted to have an innocent woman executed, all to protect your own ambitions. Do not dress that crime in the language of loyalty to my crown. Duke Whitmore said nothing further. There was, Lena understood, watching his face crumble slowly under the weight of the assembled court stairs, nothing further to say. Release her, Damien commanded, and the guards flanking Lena moved immediately to unlock her chains, the cold iron falling away from her wrists as she stood, shaking slightly, in the center of the hall. Healer Hartley is cleared of all charges, effective immediately, and I will personally see to her compensation for the harm done to her by this false imprisonment. He descended the dais steps, crossing the hall directly to where she stood, and in front of the entire assembled court, the council, both delegations, every noble house that had whispered and speculated and questioned her place in the palace for months. He took her hands in both of his gold eyes fierce and unguarded, and full of something that made her breath catch in her throat. I told you, he said quietly, though his voice still carried in the absolute silence of the hall, that I would not let them take you from me over a lie. You didn't, Lena whispered back, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. Relief and exhaustion, and something warmer, something she'd been carefully not naming for months, all rising up together at once. Behind them, guards moved to take Duke Whitmore into custody, his face still frozen in an expression of stunned, humiliated defeat, as he was led from the hall he had once dominated with such careful, patient scheming. But Lena barely noticed the commotion, barely registered the astonished murmurs still rippling through the watching crowd. She was looking only at Damien, at the man who had burned down 6 years of careful distance and controlled silence to stand publicly, unmistakably, entirely on her side, and she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm into her chest, that whatever came next for the two of them, there would be no more hiding it, no more careful pretense, No more quiet garden meetings kept secret behind palace walls. "Your Majesty," Lord Kane's voice cut gently through the moment, diplomatic as ever, though there was genuine warmth in his tone now, rather than the cold suspicion of days before. "I believe, given these revelations, we may proceed with the trade negotiations as originally scheduled. Velmara has no quarrel with a crown that pursues truth this thoroughly, even at personal cost." Damien did not look away from Lena as he answered, "Thank you, Lord Kane. I believe we have quite a bit to discuss." But it was clear to everyone watching, in that crowded hall, exactly which discussion mattered most to him in that particular moment. In the weeks following Duke Whitmore's arrest, and the collapse of his careful, patient scheme, the palace changed in ways Lena had not fully anticipated. The whispers that had once followed her through every corridor, speculative and suspicious, transformed almost overnight into something closer to respect. Even open warmth from many of the staff and nobles who had watched the entire dramatic sequence of events unfold in the receiving hall. There would always be those who resented her closeness to the crown. She understood that clearly, but the tide of palace opinion had shifted decisively in her favor, and for the first time since arriving months ago, Lena found she could walk the palace corridors without feeling like prey being carefully watched by circling hunters. Damien, too, seemed different in the weeks that followed. Not softer exactly, because the controlled authority that made him an effective ruler had not disappeared, but more open, more willing to let the court see the parts of himself he had spent 6 years carefully hiding. He no longer bothered with excuses for his visits to the infirmary. He no longer avoided being seen with her in public spaces. Rosalind, who had spent months carefully managing palace gossip on Lena's behalf, found herself with considerably less work to do, since there was very little left to conceal. "I think," Edmund observed one afternoon, watching Damien and Lena share a quiet lunch together in the infirmary garden, visible through the open window, "that this may be the happiest I have ever seen him look in 11 years of service to this palace." "I think you might be right," Rosalind agreed, a rare, genuine smile crossing her face. "Who would have thought it would take a puppy comment and a poisoning scandal to get us here?" The council, chastened by Whitmore's exposed treachery and the diplomatic disaster it had nearly caused, offered little resistance when Damien formally announced his intention to court Lena openly, a declaration that broke centuries of royal tradition, requiring the crown to marry only within established noble houses of proven lineage. There were, predictably, some voices of protest, a few remaining allies of the disgraced duke, a handful of traditionalist nobles, uncomfortable with the precedent being set. But they were quiet voices now, easily outweighed by the growing public affection for a king who had, in the space of a single dramatic season, transformed from a distant, feared symbol into something the kingdom's people could genuinely admire, a ruler willing to fight publicly, fiercely, for what he believed was right. Lena, for her part, spent the following months learning an entirely new set of skills, alongside her continued work in the infirmary. The careful diplomacy of court life, the political weight of every public appearance, the delicate balance of remaining exactly herself while stepping gradually into a role she had never once imagined for her own life. It was not always easy. There were nights she missed the simple, quiet rhythms of Thornfield fiercely, moments when the weight of palace expectation felt almost unbearable. But there was also Damien, steady and present beside her through every uncertain step, and there was the growing, unshakable knowledge that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not be facing them alone. "I received a letter from my mother yesterday," Lena told him one evening, several months after Whitmore's arrest, as they walked together through the private garden where he had first told her the truth about his father, about the gloves, about the wolf pup he had lost so young. "She wants to know if the rumors reaching Thornfield are true. Apparently the whole village has heard that their healer is going to marry a king." "And what did you tell her?" "That the rumors are in fact entirely accurate, and that I hope she'll be willing to travel here for the wedding, difficult as that journey might be for her at her age." Lena smiled, watching the last golden light of evening settle over the wild roses climbing the garden wall. "I told her you were nothing like the stories she'd always heard about the Alpha King, that underneath all that careful control, you're actually rather soft, once someone bothers to look closely enough." "Soft," Damien repeated, something dry and amused in his tone, though his gold eyes were warm as he looked at her. I believe that is a word my father would have found deeply alarming, applied to a king. Your father, Lena said gently, taking his gloved hand in hers, was wrong about a great many things, Damien. I think it's long past time this kingdom had a king who understood that gentleness and strength were never actually opposites at all. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she had come to recognize over their months together, the particular softness he reserved only for her, only in these private, unguarded moments away from the watching eyes of the court. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up with his free hand and began to peel off the glove covering his other palm, the leather sliding away to reveal skin that had not felt open air in 18 years. Damien, Lena breathed, understanding immediately the weight of what he was doing. I have worn these since I was 12 years old, he said quietly, as a reminder that my hands could not be trusted. I think, perhaps, it is time I learned to trust them again, starting with you. He reached out, bare hand trembling slightly, and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing softly against her cheek, in a gesture so tender, it brought fresh tears to her eyes. There was nothing dangerous in that touch, nothing uncontrolled or fearsome about it at all, only warmth and care, and the quiet vulnerability of a man finally, after 18 long years, allowing himself to be gentle, without the armor he'd hidden behind for so long. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying more weight for their plainness than any elaborate declaration could have managed. I have known it for months, I think, though I was too careful, too guarded to say it plainly until now. But I find I no longer wish to be careful about this. I love you, Lena Hartley, and I would very much like the entire kingdom to know it. I love you too, Lena whispered back, leaning into his bare palm against her cheek, the moment settling warm and certain into her chest. I have loved you since long before I understood what it was I was feeling, since a garden dawn, and a story about a wolf pup, and a king who was far softer underneath his crown than anyone had ever bothered to notice. They stood together in the fading evening light, the wild roses breathing their scent into the cooling air, and for the first time since her arrival at the palace all those months ago, Lena felt entirely, completely certain of exactly where she belonged. The coronation hall had never looked so full, or so bright, in all the years Rosalind had served within its walls. Every noble house in the kingdom had sent representatives. The visiting delegations from Velmara and beyond had returned specifically for the occasion, and the ordinary people of the capital had gathered by the thousands in the streets outside the palace gates, eager for a glimpse of the wedding and coronation that had become the talk of the entire realm for months. Lena stood in the small preparation chamber adjoining the great hall, her wedding dress a deep, rich gold that Rosalind had insisted matched the king's eyes perfectly, her hands trembling slightly despite the calm, steady breaths she'd been taking all morning to settle her nerves. You look radiant, Rosalind said, adjusting the delicate circlet resting in Lena's dark hair, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. I still remember the terrified girl who arrived here, clutching a satchel of herbs, convinced she was about to be executed for insulting the king. Look how far you've come. I remember her too, Lena said softly, meeting her own eyes in the tall mirror. I don't think she ever imagined this. No, Rosalind agreed, smiling. But I think, somewhere deep down, she hoped for it anyway. Edmund appeared in the doorway a moment later, dressed in formal robes so unlike his usual practical infirmary attire that Lena almost didn't recognize him at first. They're ready for you, he said, his voice gentle. Are you ready for them? Lena took one final steadying breath, thinking back over the entire winding journey that had brought her to this exact moment, the frightened arrival, the accidental words that had started everything, the quiet garden dawns, the terrifying dungeon days, the public trial that had finally, decisively turned the tide in her favor. Every step of it, difficult and frightening as parts of it had led her here, to this golden dress, and this trembling, joyful anticipation. I'm ready, she said, and meant it completely. The walk down the length of the great hall felt both impossibly long and impossibly short, every face turned toward her a blur of color and silk, until finally her eyes found Damien waiting at the front of the hall, standing before the assembled priests and council members who would oversee both the wedding ceremony and the coronation that would follow it. He wore formal robes of deep midnight blue, a simple circlet resting on his dark hair in place of the heavier ceremonial crown that would come later, and his gold eyes, when they met hers across the length of the hall, held an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Lena felt her own eyes fill with fresh tears before she'd even reached him. The ceremony itself passed in a warm golden blur, vows spoken clearly and steadily despite the emotion thickening both their voices, the priest's traditional blessings, the formal exchange of rings that marked, before the eyes of the entire kingdom, the joining of a border healer and an alpha king who had once seemed as distant and untouchable as the moon itself. When the coronation portion of the ceremony began, Lena knelt beside Damien before the head priest, feeling the weight and significance of the moment settle over her like a physical thing, and as the priest lifted the ceremonial crown to place upon her head, formally naming her queen before the assembled kingdom, she caught Damien's eye one final time. There, in that brief, private moment before the crown descended, surrounded by thousands of watching eyes and the full formal weight of a coronation centuries in tradition, Lena leaned in close enough that only he could hear her, and whispered the same 4 words that had started everything, all those months ago, in a receiving hall full of stunned silence. "It's okay, my puppy." For one breathless moment, Damien's composed, formal expression cracked entirely, and the sound that came out of him was not the small, careful, almost smile Lena had first seen all those months ago, but a genuine, startled, entirely unguarded burst of laughter, warm and real and utterly infectious, echoing through the coronation hall in a way that no one present had ever heard from their king before. The startled silence that followed lasted only a moment before the entire hall, catching the warmth and joy radiating from their king's genuine laughter, broke into delighted applause and answering laughter of their own, the formal solemnity of the coronation dissolving into something far warmer and more human than any ceremony in the palace's long history had managed before. "You are entirely incorrigible," Damien murmured to her, still fighting back laughter as the priest, bemused but clearly charmed, finally settled the crown properly onto her head. "Do you have any idea what you've just done to 6 centuries of coronation tradition?" "I believe I've improved it considerably," Lena whispered back, unable to stop her own answering smile. "That," he said, taking her hand, as they rose together to face the cheering hall, king and queen standing side by side before their entire kingdom, "I cannot possibly argue with." Later that evening, long after the formal celebrations had wound down and the great hall had emptied of its thousands of guests, Lena and Damien stood together in the private garden behind the wall the rest of the palace still didn't fully know existed, the same wild roses breathing their familiar scent into the cool night air, the same pond frogs calling softly in the darkness around them. "Do you remember?" Damien said quietly, his bare hand, both hands now, always bare now, always open, resting warm and steady around hers, "what you told me, that very first morning here, about honesty being able to be both refreshing and foolish at once?" "I remember." "I think," he said, looking down at her with the same soft, unguarded warmth that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat, "that everything about you has always been exactly both those things at once, and I think it may be the greatest fortune of my entire life." Lena rose up on her toes, pressing a soft kiss to his lips beneath the darkening sky, the crown resting new and unfamiliar, but already beloved upon her head. The man beside her no longer the distant, feared alpha king of whispered rumor and old fear, but simply Damien, hers, entirely, openly, without armor or gloves or careful, guarded distance ever again. "The greatest fortune of my life, too," she whispered back against his lips, and somewhere in the darkness of the wild garden, the frogs continued their soft evening chorus, indifferent witnesses to a love story that had begun, improbably and perfectly, with 4 soft words never meant to be spoken aloud, and had ended exactly where it always should have, in warmth, in laughter, and in the quiet, unshakable certainty of 2 people who had finally, fully found their way home to each other.